Hey guys, Rusty Historian here, and tonight we're diving into something that's going to make your worst Monday morning look like a spa day. We're talking about the terrifying fate of an opium addict in WWII. So before you get too comfortable in that chair, hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into history's darkest corners, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's good to know you and to feel that the work we put in is being seen. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack, though you might lose your appetite by the end of this, and let's jump into a world where your daily struggles would seem like absolute paradise. Picture this. It's 1942. The world is literally on fire. And you're not worried about missing your morning coffee or your Wi-Fi going down. No, you're worried about where your next hit of opium is coming from, because without it, you're going to experience a hell that makes waterboarding look like a gentle massage. Ready? Let's go back in time and walk in the shoes of someone whose story will haunt you long after this video ends. You wake up on a straw mattress that's seen better decades. The year is 1941, and you're in Shanghai's international settlement. Though settlement makes it sound way more civilized than it actually is. Think of it as the Wild West, but with rickshaws instead of horses and opium dens instead of saloons. The smell hits you first. Always the smell. It's a cocktail of human misery, industrial smoke, and something sweet and cloying that you can't quite place until you remember, oh right, that's the lingering aroma of opium from the den 3 floors below. Even when you're not smoking, it's everywhere, seeping through the floorboards like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. Your hands are shaking. Not the I need coffee kind of shaking, the my body is literally eating itself from the inside kind of shaking. Because here's the thing about opium addiction in the 1940s. There's no methadone clinic down the street, no sympathetic doctor with a prescription pad, no support groups where people sit in circles and share their feelings over stale donuts. There's just you, your craving, and a world that's about to get infinitely worse. Let's back up a bit. How did you end up here? Well, unlike what those Just Say No campaigns might have you believe, you didn't wake up one morning and think, you know what would make my life better? A crippling addiction to a substance that will destroy everything I hold dear. No, your story starts like so many others in 1930s China, with pain. Maybe it was a workplace injury at the textile factory where you pulled 12-hour shifts for pennies. Maybe it was chronic pain from malnutrition. Because, let's be real, the average Chinese worker in the 1930s wasn't exactly dining on organic kale salads. Your first taste of opium wasn't recreational, it was medicinal. Some well-meaning friend, or maybe a traditional doctor who'd run out of other options, suggested a visit to what they euphemistically called a medicine house. Just a little something to take the edge off, just temporary, just until things get better. Spoiler alert, things don't get better. They get so much worse that you'll look back on this moment as the last time you had any real control over your life. The first hit was relief, pure, unadulterated relief. For the first time in months, maybe years, your body didn't hurt, your mind quieted. The crushing weight of poverty, of hopelessness, of watching your country tear itself apart, all of it just floated away on a cloud of sweet, euphoric smoke. And that's when you learned the cruelest lesson of addiction. The thing that saves you will eventually destroy you. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now in 1941, you're still functional. You can still work, still maintain some semblance of a normal life. You tell yourself you're managing it. You're not like those other people. The skeletal figures you see stumbling through the streets, their eyes hollow, their lives reduced to a single desperate pursuit. You're wrong, of course, but you don't know that yet. What you do know is that the Japanese have been occupying parts of China since 1937, and things are getting tense. Really tense. The kind of tense where people whisper about war in the streets and everyone's looking over their shoulder. The kind of tense where normal people start hoarding rice and smart people start making exit plans. But you're not normal people, and you're definitely not smart people. You're addicted people. And addicted people don't make long-term plans. They make where's my next fix coming from plans. Here's something they don't teach you in history class. The Japanese occupation wasn't just about territory and politics, it was about control. And one of the most effective ways to control a population? Get them hooked on drugs, and then control the supply. The Japanese knew exactly what they were doing when they flooded occupied territories with cheap, readily available opium. It wasn't an accident or a side effect of war, it was strategy. Keep the people docile, desperate, and dependent, and they won't have the energy or will to resist. Congratulations, you're not just an addict, you're a pawn in a geopolitical game that's about to explode into the most devastating war in human history. Sleep tight. It's early 1942 now, and if you think things were bad before, well, you haven't seen anything yet. But for the moment, just for the moment, there's an eerie kind of stability. The Japanese have occupied your city, but life, such as it is, continues. You wake up each morning in that same straw mattress, your body immediately reminding you of its needs. It's like having an internal alarm clock. except instead of telling you it's time to get up, it's screaming that you need to score. The withdrawal symptoms start about 6 hours after your last hit. First comes the restless anxiety. Your skin feels too tight, like you're wearing a sweater made of steel wool. Then the nausea, rolling through your stomach in waves that would make seasick sailors weep with sympathy. But here's the thing about living under occupation while being an addict. The Japanese aren't just tolerating the opium trade, they're encouraging it. There are more opium dens than there are food vendors, and that's saying something in a city where people are literally eating bark soup to survive. You stumble out into the street, and the first thing that hits you is how different everything looks. Japanese signs hang above Chinese storefronts. Soldiers in uniform patrol the streets, their rifles catching the weak morning light. But what's really unsettling is how normal it all seems. People are going about their daily business, buying vegetables, arguing with vendors, children playing in the streets, as if foreign soldiers with guns aren't watching their every move. This is occupation life, not the dramatic resistance movie version, where everyone's secretly sabotaging railway lines and passing coded messages. This is the mundane, soul-crushing reality where most people just try to keep their heads down and survive another day. And you? You're trying to survive until your next hit. The den you frequent is run by an old man everyone calls Teacher Wu, though he's never taught anything except the fine art of preparing opium pipes. His place is in the basement of what used to be a tea shop. You descend narrow wooden stairs that creak like they're going to collapse under your weight, into a room that's dimly lit by oil lamps and filled with the sweet, sticky smoke that's become your oxygen. The scene is always the same. Rows of wooden platforms covered with thin mats, each occupied by someone in various stages of stupor. Some are preparing their pipes with the careful precision of a surgeon. Others are lost in their dreams, eyes closed, bodies slack. A few unlucky souls are in the corner, going through withdrawal, sweating, shaking, occasionally retching into buckets that haven't been cleaned in. Well, let's not think about that. Teacher Wu greets you with the same nod he gives everyone. No judgment, no concern, just business. In a world where everything else has become uncertain, there's something almost comforting about his consistency. You hand over your coins, money you can't afford to spend, but can even less afford not to spend, and he hands you your prepared pipe. The ritual is always the same. You lie down on your platform, place the pipe to your lips, and take that first desperate draw. And then, relief. The shaking stops. The nausea fades. The crushing anxiety that follows you like a shadow lifts, if only temporarily. For the next few hours you're free. Free from pain, free from worry, free from the reality that your world is falling apart around you. You dream of better times, of a China that exists only in your opium-hazed memories, a China where foreign soldiers don't patrol your streets, and your biggest worry was whether you could afford meat with dinner. But dreams don't last, they never do. When you emerge from the den, the sun has moved across the sky, and reality comes crashing back like a bucket of ice water. You've lost another day. Another day you could have been working or looking for work, or maybe, just maybe, trying to figure out how to get your life back together. Instead, you've spent it lying on a dirty mat, breathing poison into your lungs while your country burns around you. Here's what's particularly insidious about this period. The Japanese aren't just allowing the opium trade, they're using it as a form of economic warfare. Every coin you spend on drugs is money that's not going to support Chinese resistance efforts. Every hour you spend in that den is an hour you're not organizing, not fighting back, not even thinking clearly enough to realize what's happening to you and your country. You're not just an addict anymore, you're an unwitting collaborator in your own destruction. And the worst part? Deep down, in whatever corner of your mind isn't completely clouded by addiction, you know it. You know you're trapped. You know you're helpless. You know that every day you spend in that den is another day closer to losing whatever's left of yourself. But knowing and being able to do something about it are two very different things. The withdrawal symptoms aren't just physical, though the physical symptoms are bad enough. It's the mental torture that really gets you. The crushing depression, the anxiety that makes you feel like your skin is crawling with insects. The way every sound seems too loud and every light too bright. It's like someone turned up the volume on reality to 11, and you can't find the controls to turn it down. So you go back to the den. You always go back to the den. And each time you tell yourself it's just temporary, just until things get better, just until the war ends and life goes back to normal. But wars don't always end the way you expect them to. And normal is about to become a word you'll barely remember, because it's December 7th, 1941, and you're about to learn that there are worse things than being an addict in occupied China. You're about to learn what it's like to be an addict in a world war. December 8th, 1941. You wake up to shouting in the streets. Not the usual shouting, the normal sounds of vendors hawking their wares or children playing. This is different, urgent, frightened. You stumble outside, your body already demanding its morning fix, but something in the air makes you pause. Groups of people are clustered around anyone who has a radio, straining to hear news that's filtering in from the outside world. Pearl Harbor, the Americans have been attacked. Japan and the United States are now at war. For most people, this news would be momentous. It means the conflict that's been brewing in the Pacific has finally exploded into full-scale war. It means America will likely join the fight against Japan. It means everything is about to change. For you, your first thought is whether this means the opium supply will be disrupted. This is what addiction does. It narrows your world down to a single, overwhelming priority. While everyone else is thinking about geopolitics and the fate of nations, you're thinking about your next hit. It's not that you don't care about the bigger picture, it's that addiction has literally rewired your brain to prioritize your chemical needs above everything else, including your own long-term survival. But even through the haze of addiction, you can sense that something fundamental has shifted. The Japanese soldiers in the streets seem more tense, more alert. There are more checkpoints, more searches, more restrictions on movement. The occupation, which had settled into something resembling routine, suddenly feels much more oppressive. And you're right to be worried about the opium supply, because within weeks, everything changes. The Japanese authorities, who had been tolerating and even encouraging the drug trade, suddenly crack down, not because they've developed a conscience, but because they need resources for the war effort. Money that was flowing into opium dens is now needed for weapons and supplies. Men who were running opium operations are now needed as laborers or soldiers. This is where your story takes a turn from merely tragic to absolutely terrifying. Imagine you're an alcoholic, and one day all the alcohol in the world simply disappears. No detox centers, no medical supervision, no support systems. Just you, your addiction, and the mother of all withdrawal symptoms. That's what happens to you and thousands of other opium addicts when the Japanese suddenly decide the drug trade is no longer useful to their war effort. The first sign of trouble comes when you arrive at Teacher Wu's den to find the door boarded up. There's a notice in Japanese that you can't read, but the message is clear enough. This place is closed permanently. You try 3 other dens in the neighborhood, all closed. The 4th one you find has been raided, broken furniture, scattered paraphernalia, and dark stains on the floor that you prefer not to think about. By evening, your hands are shaking so badly you can barely hold a cup of water. By the next morning, you're sweating despite the winter cold, and your stomach feels like it's trying to eat itself from the inside. This is withdrawal, not the gentle, medically supervised kind you might experience in a modern rehab facility. This is cold turkey, 1940s style, when medical science's understanding of addiction was roughly equivalent to their understanding of quantum physics. Here's what happens to your body when you suddenly stop using opium after months or years of regular use. Your brain, which is adapted to the constant presence of the drug, suddenly doesn't know how to function normally. It's like someone ripped the steering wheel out of your car while you're driving at highway speeds. First comes the anxiety, not worry about an upcoming test or job interview, but existential terror so intense it feels like you're drowning in your own fear. Your heart races like you've just sprinted a marathon. Your skin becomes hypersensitive. Even the touch of clothing feels like sandpaper. Then comes the physical symptoms. Nausea that makes you feel like you're on a ship in a hurricane. Diarrhea that leaves you dehydrated and weak. Muscle cramps that feel like someone's twisting your limbs with pliers. And the cold. Even though you're sweating profusely, you feel cold deep in your bones, a chill that no blanket can warm. But the worst part isn't physical. It's the mental anguish, the crushing depression that makes you feel like you're at the bottom of a well with no ladder. The way colors seem faded and food tastes like cardboard. The way every positive emotion, joy, hope, satisfaction, seems to have been surgically removed from your brain. And there's no end in sight. Unlike a cold or flu, you can't just wait it out for a week. Opium withdrawal can last for months, with waves of symptoms that hit without warning, knocking you down just when you think you might be getting better. Now imagine going through all of this while living under military occupation with limited food, no medical care, and the constant threat of violence. Welcome to your new reality. But wait, it gets worse. Because while you're going through withdrawal, the war is intensifying. The Japanese need laborers for their war effort, and they're not particular about where they find them. Sick, healthy, addicted, sober. If you can stand upright, you can work. And if you can't stand upright, well, that's your problem. Roundups begin in February 1942. Japanese soldiers go door to door, pulling out men of working age for labor service. The official term is volunteer work details. But the volunteers don't get to volunteer, if you catch my drift. You try to hide. When you hear the heavy boots on the stairs, you crawl under your bed, praying they won't look too carefully. But withdrawal has left you weak and disoriented. When they kick in your door, you're too sick to run, too weak to fight, too confused to even understand what's happening. They drag you out into the street where dozens of other men are being assembled. Some are crying. Others are shouting at the soldiers in Chinese, knowing full well they won't be understood, but needing to express their rage anyway. A few are silent, already resigned to whatever's coming. And you? You're just trying not to vomit on the soldier's boots because something tells you that wouldn't improve your situation. This is the moment when your personal hell, addiction and withdrawal, collides with history's hell, total war. The result is something so awful that it will redefine your understanding of human suffering. They load you onto a truck with about 20 other men. The truck smells like diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and fear. Nobody talks. What is there to say? Nobody knows where you're going, but everyone knows it's nowhere good. As the truck bounces along roads pitted with bomb craters, you catch glimpses of a city transforming itself for war. Factories that used to make textiles are now making uniforms. Workshops that repaired bicycles are now manufacturing ammunition. Even the children playing in the streets seem different. Their games involve mock battles and air raid drills instead of traditional toys. The truck stops at a railway station where more trucks are arriving with more men. Hundreds of them. You're herded onto cattle cars, and yes, they're actual cattle cars, complete with the lingering smell of livestock and fresh hay that's been trampled into the floor. The doors slide shut with a sound that will haunt your dreams for years to come, if you live that long. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, you watch your city disappear into the distance. You're leaving behind everything you've ever known. Your home, your family, your language, your culture. You're heading into the unknown, sick and weak and completely at the mercy of people who have given you no reason to expect mercy. But here's the thing that might surprise you. In some dark corner of your mind, there's almost a sense of relief. For years, your life has been defined by a single, overwhelming need, the need for opium. Every decision, every action, every thought has been filtered through that desperate craving. Now, suddenly, that choice has been taken away from you. You can't get drugs because there are no drugs. You can't go to the den because you're locked in a cattle car heading toward an unknown destination. For the first time in years, you're not faced with the daily moral struggle of choosing between your addiction and everything else in your life. It's a strange kind of freedom. Terrifying, yes. Potentially fatal, absolutely. But also liberating in a way you hadn't expected. Of course, this relief doesn't last long, because where you're going, the choice between addiction and everything else is going to seem like the least of your problems. The train begins to move, and with each mile that passes under the wheels, you're moving further away from the life you knew and closer to an experience that will test every limit of human endurance. You don't know it yet, but you're heading to one of the most notorious labor camps in the Japanese Empire, a place where men are worked to death building infrastructure for the war effort, a place where the strong barely survive and the weak don't. And you, shaking with withdrawal, weak from months of malnutrition and completely unprepared for physical labor, you're about to discover what it really means to be at the bottom of the food chain in wartime. Sweet dreams. The train ride lasts 3 days. 3 days in a cattle car packed with frightened men, with one bucket for water and another for waste, and absolutely no information about where you're going or what's waiting for you when you get there. By the second day, the withdrawal symptoms are peaking. You spend hours curled in a corner, alternately shivering and sweating, your body racked with cramps that feel like someone's tightening vice grips around your muscles. The other men in the car give you a wide berth, partly out of disgust, partly out of fear that whatever you have might be contagious. They don't understand that what you have isn't a disease you can catch. It's a disease you choose, one small decision at a time, until suddenly it's choosing you. On the third day, the train stops with a screech of brakes that seems to go on forever. Through the gaps in the wooden slats, you can see mountains, tall, forbidding mountains covered in dense forest. The air that filters in is thin and cold, with a bite that cuts right through your clothes. The doors slide open and Japanese soldiers bark orders you don't understand. But you understand the universal language of rifle barrels pointed in your direction, so you stumble out of the car along with everyone else. Welcome to Burma. Specifically, you're somewhere along what will become known as the Burma Railway, though the people who build it will call it the Death Railway. And trust me, that's not hyperbole. Your first glimpse of the worksite is like looking into the mouth of hell. Hundreds of men, Chinese, Burmese, Indian, British prisoners of war, Dutch colonials, and others you can't identify, are hacking away at solid rock with hand tools. They're building a railway through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, through jungles where diseases lurk in every mosquito bite, and mountains where one wrong step means a fatal fall. And they're doing it with shovels, pickaxes, and dynamite that's as likely to blow you up as it is to clear the rock. The Japanese have a schedule to keep. They need this railway operational as quickly as possible to supply their forces fighting in Burma and India. They've calculated that a certain number of laborers will die in the process. It's built into their planning, like accounting for the cost of materials or fuel. You are not a person here. You're a unit of expendable labor. And if you break down, well, there are plenty more where you came from. A Japanese engineer, flanked by guards with fixed bayonets, addresses the new arrivals. He speaks in heavily accented English, which is translated into Chinese by a collaborator who looks almost as frightened as the rest of you. The rules are simple. You will work from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week. No exceptions for sickness, weather, or any other reason. You'll be fed 2 meals a day, rice and vegetables if you're lucky. If you're unlucky, rice and whatever they scraped off the floor of the supply tent. You will sleep in barracks that house 50 men each. Personal space is a luxury you can forget about. Escape attempts will be punished by death, not just for the person who tries to escape, but for 10 randomly selected men from his work detail. Questions are not encouraged. Actually, questions are punishable by beating. Any complaints about working conditions will be considered sabotage and treated accordingly. Oh, and one more thing. The railway must be completed in 18 months. If it's not, everyone's rations will be cut in half until it is. Have a nice day. You're assigned to a work gang responsible for clearing a section of jungle where the railway will eventually run. Your tools are a machete, a shovel, and your bare hands. Your supervisor is a British POW named Thompson, who's been here for 6 months and looks like he's aged 10 years in that time. All right then, he says in a voice that's been scraped raw by months of shouting over construction noise. Here's how it works. We clear everything. Trees, bushes, rocks, stumps, everything. Down to bare earth. Then we level the ground so it's ready for the rail crews. Simple enough, yeah? You nod, though nothing about this seems simple. The jungle around you is so dense you can barely see 10 feet in any direction. The trees are massive, their trunks easily 6 feet in diameter. Vines hang down like natural rope, except they're covered in thorns that will shred your skin if you brush against them. And the wildlife? Let's just say Disney lied about the jungle being a fun place where animals sing songs and help lost children find their way home. One more thing, Thompson adds, his voice dropping to a whisper. Watch out for the guards. Some of them are decent enough. They just want to get through this war like the rest of us. But some of them, he glances around nervously. Some of them seem to enjoy this a bit too much, if you catch my meaning. You catch his meaning. Your first day of work lasts 14 hours. 14 hours of swinging a machete at vegetation that seems to grow back as fast as you can cut it down. 14 hours of hauling logs that weigh more than you do. 14 hours of digging stumps out of ground so hard it might as well be concrete. And you're still going through withdrawal. Every 20 minutes or so, you have to stop and vomit. Sometimes it's just bile because there's nothing else in your stomach. Sometimes it's blood, which is probably not a good sign. Your hands shake so badly you can barely grip your tools, and the muscle cramps come in waves that literally drop you to your knees. The other men in your work gang aren't sympathetic. They can't afford to be. If one person doesn't pull his weight, everyone suffers. If the work quota isn't met, everyone's food gets reduced. If the guards think someone is slacking, they might beat the entire crew just to make a point. So when you collapse for the 4th time that day, Thompson pulls you aside. Listen, mate, he says, not unkindly, but not exactly gently either. I don't know what your problem is, but you need to sort it out fast. The guards are already asking questions about the new Chinese fellow who keeps falling down. And when the guards start asking questions, he doesn't finish the sentence. He doesn't need to. Somehow, you make it through the first day. You stumble back to the barracks as the sun sets, your body screaming in protest with every step. The barracks are long, low buildings made of bamboo and corrugated metal, with sleeping platforms arranged in tiers like bunk beds from hell. Your sleeping space is a bamboo mat, about 6 feet long and 2 feet wide. That's it. No pillow, no blanket, no privacy. Just you, your mat, and the symphony of snores, coughs, groans, and occasional screams from 50 other men dealing with their own particular brands of misery. The food, if you can call it food, is a bowl of rice with some unidentifiable vegetables floating in it. The rice is mostly husks and grit, and the vegetables taste like they've been boiled in dishwater. But it's calories, and calories are life, so you choke it down. That night, you don't sleep, partly because of the withdrawal symptoms, which seem to get worse when you lie still, partly because of the sounds, the constant background noise of men coughing, crying, praying in languages you don't recognize, and partly because you're beginning to understand, with a clarity that cuts through even your drug-addled brain, just how bad the situation really is. You're in a slave labor camp, thousands of miles from home, building a railway for an enemy army. You're sick, weak, and completely at the mercy of people who view you as a disposable resource. The work is dangerous, the conditions are brutal, and the mortality rate is, well, let's just say they don't keep detailed records for a reason. And somehow, impossibly, you're beginning to realize that this might actually be the thing that saves your life. Not the camp. God, no, this place is trying to kill you. But the forced withdrawal from opium. For the first time in years, you're not spending every waking moment obsessing about your next fix. You can't, because there is no next fix. That option has been completely removed from your life. It's like someone amputated part of your brain, the part that was consumed with drug-seeking behavior. And now you're discovering that there were other parts you'd forgotten about. Parts that can think about survival, about endurance, about something other than the next high. Don't get me wrong, you're still incredibly sick. The withdrawal symptoms are ongoing and will be for months. You're weak, malnourished, and working in conditions that would challenge a healthy person. But for the first time in years, your mind is starting to clear. And clarity, even terrible clarity, is better than the fog you've been living in. Day 2 is marginally better. You still vomit regularly, and the shaking hasn't stopped, but you manage to work a full shift without collapsing. Thompson nods approvingly when he sees you're still upright at the end of the day. "Good on you, mate," he says. "I was wondering if you'd make it through the week." Week? You can barely imagine making it through tomorrow, but you do. Day 3 comes and goes, then day 4. By the end of the first week, something remarkable has happened. You're still alive. Not thriving, not healthy, not anything approaching comfortable, but alive. And in a place like this, alive is a victory worth celebrating. Of course, the celebration is brief because week 2 brings new challenges. The work quota has been increased because the Japanese are behind schedule. The food rations have been decreased because supplies are running low, and the weather has turned from merely unpleasant to actively hostile. Monsoon season has arrived. Working in the monsoon is like working inside a car wash, except the water is mud-colored and comes down with the force of a fire hose. Everything is slippery. Tools slip out of your hands. Footing becomes treacherous. Visibility drops to almost nothing. And still you work, because the alternative is death. But here's the thing that's starting to become clear. You're tougher than you thought. Not physically. Physically, you're still a mess. But mentally, you're discovering reserves of endurance you didn't know you possessed. Years of addiction had convinced you that you were weak, that you couldn't handle pain or discomfort, that you needed chemical assistance to cope with life's challenges. But now, forced to endure unimaginable hardship without any chemical crutch, you're learning that you're capable of far more than you ever imagined. This doesn't mean you're grateful for the experience. That would be Stockholm Syndrome on steroids. This place is hell, and the people running it are monsters. But inadvertently, accidentally, they're forcing you to rediscover parts of yourself that had been buried under years of drug use. It's like finding out you can swim by being thrown into the ocean during a hurricane. Definitely not the preferred method of learning, but effective nonetheless. As the weeks turn into months, you settle into a routine that would have been unimaginable when you first arrived. Up before dawn, work until dusk, eat whatever passes for food, collapse onto your mat, repeat. The withdrawal symptoms gradually subside, replaced by the more manageable misery of malnutrition, exhaustion, and constant physical pain. Your hands, which once shook from drug withdrawal, now shake from overwork and poor nutrition. Your stomach, which once cramped from chemical dependence, now cramps from hunger. In a twisted way, it's progress. But the real test is still coming. Because as 1942 turns into 1943 and the railway project falls further behind schedule, the Japanese are going to get increasingly desperate. And when desperate people have absolute power over other people, the results are never pretty. You're about to learn that surviving withdrawal was just the appetizer. The main course of suffering is about to be served. March 1943. You've been in the camp for nearly a year now, and you're not the same person who stumbled off that cattle car 12 months ago. Physically, you're a skeleton wrapped in skin that's been turned to leather by sun and weather. Your ribs are visible even through your torn shirt, and your arms have the diameter of broomsticks. But you're alive, which is more than can be said for about 40% of the men who arrived with you. The camp cemetery, if you can call a bunch of unmarked graves in the jungle a cemetery, has grown from a small clearing to a significant portion of the hillside. The graves are shallow because the men digging them are too weak to dig deep, and the jungle rain keeps washing bones to the surface. Sometimes you'll find a skull grinning up at you from the path, polished clean by ants and weather. It's not exactly the kind of thing they put in travel brochures. The railway is about 60% complete, but progress has slowed to a crawl. Not because the men are lazy. Nobody's lazy when the alternative is a beating or worse, but because the workforce is literally dying faster than it can be replaced. This is where the mathematics of slave labor becomes clear. You need a certain number of calories per day to do heavy physical work. If you provide fewer calories than required, workers become less productive. Provide significantly fewer calories, and they start dying. Continue the trend, and eventually you have no workers at all. The Japanese have calculated this equation, and their solution is elegantly simple. Work people harder and faster before they die. Your daily work quota has been increased again. The workday now runs from before sunrise to well after sunset. About 16 hours of manual labor with 2 10-minute breaks and 20 minutes for lunch. The food rations have been cut again because supply lines are being disrupted by Allied bombing campaigns, and the mortality rate has gone from tragic to catastrophic. Men are dying from everything: dysentery, malaria, dengue fever, infected wounds, exhaustion, malnutrition, and combinations thereof. The camp hospital is a bamboo hut with no medicine, no equipment, and no trained medical staff. The doctor is a Japanese soldier who learned basic first aid in the army and whose primary medical philosophy seems to be, if you can stand up, you can work. You've watched men die slowly over weeks, their bodies consuming themselves as they continue working until they literally drop. You've seen others go quickly. A sudden fever, a fall from a bridge under construction, an infected cut that turns gangrenous in the tropical heat. There's no pattern to it, no logic you can discern. Strong men die while weak men survive. Optimists die while pessimists endure. Young men die while old men somehow keep going. The randomness of it is almost worse than the certainty would be. But here's what's kept you alive when so many others have died. Your experience with addiction has taught you something valuable about enduring misery. You know how to exist in a state of constant physical discomfort. You know how to function when your body is screaming for relief. You know how to break time down into manageable chunks. Not thinking about tomorrow or next week, just focusing on getting through the next hour, the next task, the next meal. It's a skill set you never wanted to develop, but it's keeping you breathing. Of course, survival isn't just about individual toughness. It's also about luck, and your luck is about to be tested in ways that will make everything you've experienced so far seem like a warm-up. The monsoon season of 1943 is particularly brutal. Rain falls in sheets so dense you can't see more than a few feet in any direction. The work sites become rivers of mud. Tools slip from hands, slick with rain and sweat. Footing becomes treacherous on slopes that are essentially waterfalls. And still the work continues. You're part of a crew building a bridge across a river that's running so high and fast, it sounds like a freight train. The bridge is a crude affair. Wooden beams and bamboo planking held together with rope and prayer. It's the kind of construction that would never be approved by any safety inspector. But safety inspectors are in short supply in the Burmese jungle. Your job is to carry wooden beams from the supply area to the construction site. Each beam weighs about 200 pounds and requires 4 men to lift it. The path between supply and site is a narrow trail that's been turned into a slip and slide by the constant rain. On a Tuesday morning in July, you've lost track of the exact date, but you know it's Tuesday because the guards seem particularly sadistic on Tuesdays. You're carrying a beam with 3 other men when disaster strikes. The man at the front of the beam, a Burmese laborer named Aung, who's been in the camp longer than anyone, suddenly stumbles. Maybe he slipped on the muddy path, or maybe he finally succumbed to the malaria that's been eating him alive for weeks. Either way, he goes down, and the beam goes with him. 200 pounds of wet timber falling from shoulder height doesn't give you much time to react. You try to jump clear, but your reflexes have been slowed by months of malnutrition and exhaustion. The beam catches you across the left leg, just below the knee, with a sound like a tree branch snapping. The pain is immediate and overwhelming. Not the dull ache of chronic hunger or the persistent throb of infected cuts, but a sharp, bright agony that sends lightning bolts up your spine and makes your vision go white around the edges. You know immediately that something is very, very wrong with your leg. Aung doesn't get up. He's lying face down in the mud, motionless, and the growing pool of blood around his head suggests he's not going to be getting up ever again. The other 2 men on the beam are shouting in languages you don't understand, but their tone is universal. Panic mixed with the kind of fear that comes from knowing you're about to be blamed for something that wasn't your fault. A Japanese guard appears within seconds, drawn by the commotion. He takes in the scene, the fallen beam, the dead Burmese man, you clutching your leg and trying not to scream, and his expression doesn't change. If anything, he looks annoyed, like this is just another minor inconvenience in his day. He barks orders in Japanese, and the other 2 men immediately start trying to lift the beam off your leg. The movement sends fresh waves of agony through your body, but you bite down on your tongue to keep from crying out. Showing weakness in front of the guards is never a good idea. When they finally get the beam clear, you try to stand. Your right leg supports you fine, but your left leg, well, let's just say it's not cooperating. The moment you put weight on it, the pain becomes so intense you actually do cry out, despite your best efforts. The guard looks at you with the expression of a mechanic examining a broken tool. He says something in Japanese that you don't understand, but the tone is clear enough. He's calculating whether you're worth fixing or whether it would be easier to just throw you away and get a replacement. This is a decision point that will determine whether you live or die, and it's completely out of your hands. The guard calls over another Japanese soldier, apparently someone with more authority. They have a brief conversation while you stand there on one leg, trying not to fall over. You catch a few words that might be numbers, probably discussing your productivity ratings, how long you've been in the camp, whether you're worth the minimal medical resources required to keep you functional. Finally, the senior guard nods and says something that sounds like a decision. The first guard grabs your arm and starts half dragging, half carrying you toward the camp hospital. The hospital, as I mentioned, is a bamboo hut that smells like infection and despair. The floor is dirt, the roof leaks, and the medical supplies consist of some bandages that have been washed and reused so many times they're more gray than white, a bottle of iodine that's mostly empty, and a saw that's used for amputations when infections get too bad. The doctor examines your leg with hands that haven't been washed since the last patient. His technique consists mainly of poking and prodding while watching your face for reactions. When he presses on a particular spot, just below your knee, you nearly pass out from the pain. He says something in Japanese, then switches to broken English. Bone break. No good. Maybe cut off. This is not what you wanted to hear. But then he examines it more carefully, moving your leg this way and that while you grip the sides of the bamboo table so hard your knuckles turn white. After what feels like hours but is probably only minutes, he says something else. Maybe no cut. Try fix. He disappears for a few minutes and returns with what appears to be a tree branch that's been carved into a rough approximation of a splint. Without any painkillers, anesthesia, or even a warning, he starts manipulating your leg to set the bone. The pain is indescribable. It's like being struck by lightning, except the lightning doesn't stop. It just keeps coming in waves that make you feel like your consciousness is being torn apart and reassembled. You hear someone screaming and realize it's you. When he's finished, your leg is immobilized in a contraption of bamboo and rope that looks like something from a medieval torture chamber. The doctor gives you 2 aspirin, apparently the extent of his pharmaceutical supplies, and tells you to rest for 1 day. 1 day to recover from a broken leg. In a slave labor camp where resting means no food and where the guards might decide you're malingering and beat you for good measure. But you don't have any other options. So you spend the next 24 hours lying on a bamboo mat in the hospital, listening to other patients moan, cough, and occasionally die. The sounds never stop. It's like a symphony of human suffering, conducted by fever and orchestrated by disease. During this enforced rest, something interesting happens. For the first time in months, you have time to think. Really think, not just the immediate tactical thinking required to survive the next work shift, but deeper reflection about your situation and your future. You realize that 6 months ago, if someone had told you that you'd be lying in a jungle hospital with a broken leg, surrounded by dying men, thousands of miles from home, you would have considered it a fate worse than death. But now you're oddly grateful just to be lying down. It's a measure of how much your expectations have been recalibrated by experience. More importantly, you realize that somewhere along the way, you stopped thinking about opium. Not because you don't remember it, but because the immediate demands of survival have crowded out almost everything else. The craving that once dominated every waking moment has been replaced by more pressing needs: food, water, rest, avoiding death. You're still physically dependent on the drug. If you had access to opium, you'd probably still use it. But the psychological obsession, the constant mental preoccupation with getting and using drugs, has been burned away by more immediate concerns. It's like discovering that your house is on fire and suddenly you're not worried about the lawn needing mowing. When your day of rest is over, you're back to work. The leg isn't healed, won't be for months, but the doctor has determined that you can still be useful for light duty. Light duty, in this context, means anything that doesn't require running or heavy lifting. So instead of carrying timber beams, you're assigned to sorting supplies, maintaining tools, and other tasks that can be done while sitting or standing in one place. It's still work and it's still mandatory, but it's infinitely better than the alternative, which would be getting shot as a useless mouth to feed. The broken leg actually saves your life in an unexpected way. While you're on light duty, your former work crew is assigned to one of the most dangerous jobs in the camp, blasting through a rock formation using dynamite that's as likely to explode prematurely as it is to work properly. On a Thursday afternoon, you hear an explosion that's much louder than the usual controlled blasts, then screaming, then silence. 8 men died in that accident, including Thompson, the British POW who'd helped you survive your first days in the camp. The dynamite exploded while they were placing charges, turning solid rock into deadly shrapnel and 8 human beings into memories. If you hadn't broken your leg, you would have been there. You would have been one of the 8. The randomness of survival becomes even clearer. You're alive, not because you're stronger or smarter or more deserving than Thompson, but because a beam fell on your leg at exactly the right time to save your life by nearly killing you. There's no moral to this story, no lesson about cosmic justice or divine intervention. Sometimes shit just happens, and sometimes that shit accidentally works in your favor. But survival isn't just about luck. It's also about adaptation, and you're getting very good at adapting. Your broken leg heals slowly and imperfectly. You'll always walk with a slight limp, and it will ache in cold weather for the rest of your life. But it heals enough to function, and in a place where function is the difference between life and death, that's more than sufficient. By late 1943, the railway is nearing completion. The Japanese are pushing harder than ever to finish the project, which means longer workdays, reduced rations, and increased brutality for anyone who doesn't meet their quotas. But paradoxically, this is also when conditions begin to improve slightly, not because the Japanese have developed humanitarian instincts, but because they're starting to realize that dead workers can't finish railways. They begin providing slightly more food and slightly better medical care, not out of kindness, but out of practical necessity. It's too little, too late for thousands of men who've already died, but for those still alive, it makes the difference between bare survival and something that might charitably be called existence. You're in the latter category now. Still malnourished, still exhausted, still living in conditions that would appall any civilized person, but no longer actively dying on a daily basis. You've reached an equilibrium between the demands being placed on your body and your ability to meet those demands. It's not life as most people would understand it, but it's enough. And then, just when you've accepted that this is your new permanent reality, everything changes. Again, December 15th, 1944. You're sorting through a pile of rusted tools when you hear something that makes you freeze. Aircraft engines. But not the familiar drone of Japanese planes that occasionally fly overhead. These engines have a different sound, deeper, more powerful. Allied aircraft. The worksite erupts in controlled chaos. Japanese guards are shouting orders, herding workers toward the jungle for cover. But there's something different in their voices. Not the usual confidence and authority, but something that sounds almost like that's fear. You hobble toward the jungle as fast as your damaged leg will carry you, but part of you is listening intently to those aircraft engines. They're not just passing overhead. They're circling, like predators sizing up their prey. Then the bombing starts. The first explosion hits a supply depot about half a mile away, and the concussion wave knocks you flat on your face. The sound is incredible, not just loud, but physical, like being punched by the air itself. Your ears ring so badly you can't hear anything for several minutes. But you can see. Oh, can you see? Allied bombers, B-24 Liberators, though you don't know their designation, are systematically destroying the railway you've spent nearly 3 years building. Bridges that cost dozens of lives to construct are disappearing in clouds of smoke and debris. Supply depots are erupting in mushroom clouds of flame. The railway itself, those miles of track that represent thousands of man-hours of backbreaking labor, is being torn apart like a child's toy. It should be depressing, watching 3 years of your life's work being destroyed in a matter of hours. Instead, it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. Because those bombs aren't just destroying a railway. They're destroying the system that's kept you enslaved for 3 years. Every explosion brings you one step closer to freedom. The bombing continues for 2 hours. When it finally stops, the worksite looks like the surface of the moon. Nothing is left intact. The railway is completely severed in at least a dozen places. The bridges are gone. The supply depots are smoking craters. And the Japanese guards look like men who've just realized their world is ending. Because it is. The railway project is abandoned within a week. There's no point in continuing when Allied bombers can destroy in hours what takes months to build. The Japanese military apparatus in Burma is collapsing, and suddenly keeping thousands of slave laborers fed and guarded is a luxury they can no longer afford. On December 23rd, 1944, a date you'll remember for the rest of your life, the camp commandant makes an announcement through interpreters. The railway project is terminated. All laborers are to be released immediately. Transportation will be provided to the nearest town, from which you can make your own arrangements to return home. You're free, just like that. After 3 years of slavery, brutality, and watching hundreds of men die around you, someone walks up to a microphone and says, "You're free." It doesn't feel real. It can't be real. Freedom isn't something that happens to people like you, people who've been broken down to their most basic elements, people who've learned to measure their lives in rations and work quotas. But it is real. The next morning, trucks arrive to take you away from the camp. The same type of trucks that brought you here 3 years ago, but this time, you're climbing into them voluntarily. As your truck pulls away from the camp, you look back at the place that's been your entire world for 3 years. The bamboo barracks where you slept on a mat 2 feet wide. The work sites where you hauled timber and broke rocks. The cemetery where so many of your fellow prisoners are buried in unmarked graves. You expect to feel relief, or joy, or something positive. Instead, you feel empty, hollow, like someone has scooped out your insides and left you with a shell that looks human but contains nothing recognizable as emotion. This is what psychologists would later call survivor's guilt, though the term hasn't been invented yet. You're alive when so many others died. You're free when they never will be. And there's no logical reason why you deserve to survive when they didn't. The truck drops you off in a town whose name you don't know, somewhere in Burma near the Thai border. You're given a small amount of money, compensation, the Japanese official calls it, though the amount wouldn't buy you a decent meal in peacetime, and told that from here, you're on your own. This is where your story takes another unexpected turn because freedom, it turns out, is not the same thing as salvation. You're free from the camp, yes, but you're also alone in a foreign country, speaking a language you don't understand, with no money, no identification, no way to contact your family, and no clear path home. You're free to starve, free to die of disease, free to be robbed, murdered, or enslaved again by someone else. Freedom, you discover, is just another word for having no one responsible for keeping you alive except yourself. And yourself is not in great shape. 3 years of malnutrition have left you weighing about 90 pounds. Your teeth are loose from scurvy. Your leg still aches constantly. You have chronic dysentery, probably malaria, and a persistent cough that might be tuberculosis. In the camp, these health problems were just obstacles to overcome in the pursuit of daily survival. Out here in the world, they're potentially fatal liabilities. The town where you've been abandoned is called WWII, and it's a mess. The war has passed through here multiple times, leaving behind bombed-out buildings, displaced refugees, and an economy that runs on black market trading and desperation. You find lodging, if you can call it lodging, in a refugee camp that's basically a collection of tents and lean-tos housing people from a dozen different countries. There are Chinese workers like yourself, Burmese civilians fleeing the fighting, Indian merchants who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and even a few European colonials who've been living rough since the Japanese invaded. Everyone has a story. Everyone has lost something. Everyone is trying to figure out how to get home to a world that's been transformed by war. Your first challenge is simply staying alive while you figure out your next move. The refugee camp provides minimal food, a daily bowl of rice with whatever vegetables or protein can be scrounged from the surrounding area. It's not much, but it's more reliable than what you've been eating for the past 3 years. Your second challenge is more complex. How do you get from Burma to China when there's a war going on and no functioning transportation system? The answer, you discover, is that you don't, at least not quickly and not safely. Burma is still a war zone. The Japanese are retreating, but they're fighting every step of the way. The British and Chinese forces are advancing, but slowly and with constant battles. Roads are impassable due to fighting, bombing, or simple lack of maintenance. Railways, what's left of them, are reserved for military use. You could try to walk. It's only about 500 miles from where you are to the Chinese border. Of course, those 500 miles include some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, multiple active war zones, several different armies that might shoot you on sight, and diseases that could kill you before you make it 50 miles. Or you could wait. Wait for the war to end, for transportation to be restored, for some kind of organized repatriation program to be established. You choose to wait, because walking 500 miles in your current condition would be suicide. This turns out to be both the right decision and the wrong decision. Right, because attempting the journey in early 1945 would probably have killed you. Wrong, because waiting means spending months in a refugee camp that's only marginally better than the labor camp you just escaped. But something interesting happens during those months of waiting. For the first time in years, you have nothing you're required to do. No work quotas to meet, no guards to avoid, no immediate life or death decisions to make every day. You have time to think, really think. And what you think about, surprisingly, is not the horrors you've endured, but the person you used to be before all of this started. You remember the man who first tried opium to deal with chronic pain, the man who thought he could control his usage, manage his addiction, maintain some semblance of a normal life while using drugs recreationally. That man seems like a stranger now. Not because you've forgotten him, but because you've learned things about yourself that he never could have imagined. You've learned that you can endure unimaginable hardship. You've learned that you can function without chemical assistance, even when that function is reduced to the most basic level of survival. You've learned that you're stronger than you thought you were. This doesn't mean you're grateful for the experience. That would be insane. But it does mean you're beginning to understand that the person who survives this experience will be fundamentally different from the person who entered it. The question is, what kind of person will that be? Months pass. The war gradually winds down. Germany surrenders in May 1945. Japan surrenders in August. Slowly, very slowly, some semblance of normal transportation and communication begins to be restored. In September 1945, nearly 9 months after your release from the labor camp, you finally board a train that will take you toward home. Not to your old home, that world no longer exists, but to whatever's left of the place you came from. The journey takes 2 weeks and involves multiple transfers, document checks, and delays while various armies figure out who you are and whether you're supposed to be where you are. You travel through landscapes that have been transformed by war. Cities reduced to rubble, countryside scarred by trenches and bomb craters, refugee camps that stretch to the horizon. When you finally cross the border into China, you barely recognize your own country. The civil war between communists and nationalists, which had been simmering before the Japanese invasion, has exploded into full-scale conflict. The cities you remember are either destroyed or controlled by armies you don't recognize. Your hometown, when you finally reach it, is a shadow of what it used to be. Half the buildings are gone. Most of the people you knew are either dead, disappeared, or scattered to other parts of the country. The opium dens that once defined your daily routine have been destroyed or shut down. The world you knew, the world you were addicted to, no longer exists. And that, paradoxically, might be the best thing that could have happened to you. October 17th, 1945. You're standing on what used to be the corner of Nanjing Road and Sichuan Road in Shanghai, but you have to check the street signs twice because nothing looks familiar. The building where you used to live is a pile of rubble with weeds growing through the broken concrete. The textile factory where you once worked is a blackened shell with its roof caved in. Even the street itself is different, narrower somehow, like the city has shrunk while you were away. You ask a passing vendor if he knows what happened to the people who used to live in your building. He looks at you like you're speaking a foreign language, then shrugs and says, "Foreign bombs, Japanese bombs, Chinese bombs. Who knows which one got your building? Everybody's dead or gone. You looking for someone specific?" You realize you can't answer that question. Looking for someone specific? You don't even know if you have any family left alive. Your parents were elderly when you left. They'd be in their 70s now, assuming they survived the war, the occupation, the famine, and the current civil war. Your sister moved to another city in 1938, and you never heard from her again. You're not looking for someone specific. You're looking for anyone who might remember that you used to exist. This is the peculiar cruelty of returning home after a traumatic experience. The home you remembered, the home that sustained you through the worst moments of your captivity, that home is gone. It exists only in your memory, and your memory is unreliable because it's been filtered through years of suffering. You find temporary lodging in what used to be a hotel, but is now basically a flophouse for refugees, returning soldiers, and other displaced people. Your room is 6 feet by 8 feet, with walls so thin you can hear your neighbors breathing. The mattress is stuffed with newspaper and smells like a dozen previous occupants who weren't particularly concerned with hygiene. But it's your space. No guards, no work quotas, no one telling you when to sleep or wake up. After 4 years of having every moment of your life controlled by others, this small freedom feels enormous. The first thing you do is look for work. Not because you're eager to return to the rhythms of normal life, but because you need money to eat and you need something to occupy your mind during the day. Idle time, you've discovered, is not your friend. When you're not focused on immediate survival tasks, your brain starts replaying memories you'd rather keep buried. Finding work turns out to be more complicated than you expected. The economy is in shambles. Factories that weren't destroyed by bombing have been shut down due to lack of raw materials or fuel. The ones that are still operating are run by people who fled during the war and returned to find their businesses looted or damaged. Nobody's hiring strangers, especially strangers who look like they've been through hell and can't provide references from the past 4 years of their life. "Where have you been working?" asks the factory foreman when you inquire about a job. "Burma," you say. "Building a railway?" He looks at you with the expression of someone trying to decide if you're lying, crazy, or just unlucky. "Burma? What were you doing in Burma?" You could explain about the labor camp, the forced conscription, the years of slave labor building infrastructure for the Japanese war effort. But you've learned that people don't really want to hear those stories. They make people uncomfortable. They're too big, too awful, too outside the normal range of human experience. So instead you say, "Construction work. The war made travel difficult." He nods like this explanation makes sense, though you can see in his eyes that he knows you're not telling the whole story, but he doesn't push it. Everyone has stories they're not telling these days. "No work here," he says. "Try the docks. They're always looking for men who can lift things." The docks are a revelation. Not because they're pleasant, they're loud, dangerous, and smell like a combination of fish, diesel fuel, and human sweat, but because they're functional. Ships are coming and going, cargo is being loaded and unloaded, money is changing hands. It's a little pocket of normal economic activity in a city that's otherwise held together with string and prayer. You get hired as a day laborer, loading and unloading cargo ships. The pay is minimal, but it's daily pay, which means you can eat every day without having to budget for the week ahead. More importantly, the work is familiar, hauling heavy objects from one place to another just like you did for 3 years in the labor camp. Except this time, no one is pointing a rifle at you while you do it. The physical work helps, not because you enjoy it, but because it's concrete and immediate. Lift this crate, carry it to that truck, stack it with the others. Simple tasks with clear outcomes. After years of chaos and uncertainty, there's something comforting about work that has obvious beginning, middle, and end points. But the psychological adjustment is more complicated. You keep waiting for someone to tell you what to do. In the camp, every moment of your day was structured by external authority. Wake up at this time, work on this task, eat this food, sleep on this mat. For 3 years, you made virtually no independent decisions about how to spend your time. Now, suddenly, you have choices. You can work or not work. You can eat this food or that food. You can go to bed early or stay up late. You can spend your money on rent, food, clothes, or entertainment. Choice, it turns out, is exhausting when you're out of practice. You find yourself gravitating toward routines that mimic the structure of camp life. You wake up at the same time every day, even though no one is forcing you to. You eat the same simple meals, even though more varied food is available. You go to bed at the same time every night, even though you could stay up if you wanted to. It's not conscious nostalgia for the camp. God knows you don't miss being enslaved. It's more like your brain has been rewired for survival under extreme conditions, and it doesn't know how to operate in a world where survival is more or less guaranteed. This is what we'd now call post-traumatic stress, though the term won't be widely used for another few decades. Your nervous system is still calibrated for a world where any mistake could be fatal, where constant vigilance was the difference between life and death, where the margin for error was essentially zero. But this is 1945, and nobody talks about the psychological effects of trauma. Men who've been through hell are expected to be grateful they survived and get on with their lives. There are no support groups, no therapists, no recognition that the mind can be as damaged by extreme experiences as the body. You're on your own with your demons. The demons are varied. Sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night, convinced you can hear guards shouting in Japanese. You lie in your narrow bed, heart pounding, waiting for the sound of boots on wooden floors that never comes. Sometimes you're standing in line for food and suddenly you're back in the camp, waiting for your daily ration of rice and vegetables, terrified that you'll be too late and there won't be enough. You have to force yourself to remember that there's plenty of food available, that no one is going to beat you if you're late, that you can buy more food tomorrow if you want to. Sometimes you're walking down the street and you see a man in uniform. Any uniform, doesn't matter if it's Chinese police or a bus driver or a hotel doorman, and your body goes into full panic mode. Your heart rate spikes, your breathing becomes shallow, your hands start to shake. You have to duck into an alley and wait for the feeling to pass. But the strangest demon of all is the absence of craving. For years before the war, your entire life revolved around opium. Every decision, every action, every thought was filtered through the need to obtain and use drugs. It was a miserable existence, but it was also simple. You always knew what you wanted, even if you couldn't always get it. Now, you don't know what you want. Food, shelter, safety, these basic needs are more or less met. But beyond that, you feel like someone has removed your internal compass. You don't know what direction to go because you don't know what destination you're trying to reach. The opium dens are gone, destroyed by war or shut down by the new authorities. Even if they were still operating, you find that you don't miss them. Not because you've overcome your addiction through strength of will, but because the person who was addicted to opium feels like someone else entirely. It's like discovering that you no longer enjoy a food you used to love. Not because the food has changed, but because your taste buds have been altered by experience. This should be good news, right? You've been forced through the most brutal detox program imaginable and somehow come out the other side free from chemical dependence. You should be celebrating. Instead, you feel lost. Because addiction, for all its horrors, provided structure and purpose to your life. You knew what you needed, you knew why you needed it, and you knew what you had to do to get it. It was a terrible purpose, but it was purpose nonetheless. Now you're clean, sober, and completely adrift. This is a problem nobody talks about in recovery circles. What do you do with your life when you're no longer spending all your time and energy pursuing drugs? How do you find meaning and direction when the thing that gave your life structure, even if that structure was destructive, is no longer there? You try to rebuild connections with other people, but that's complicated too. The people you knew before the war are mostly gone. The people you meet now don't understand what you've been through, and you don't understand what they've been through either. Everyone in post-war China has trauma, but the traumas are different. Some people lost family members to Japanese bombing, others lost their businesses to wartime destruction. Still others spent the war years hiding in caves or fleeing from one city to another. Your trauma, labor camp, slave work, systematic brutalization, is outside most people's experience. When you try to describe it, you can see their eyes glaze over, not because they don't care, but because the scale of it is so far beyond their reference points that they can't process it. So you stop trying to explain, you develop a short, sanitized version of your story. I was in Burma during the war, working on construction projects. It was difficult, but I survived. This version is technically true, but it's so incomplete that it's almost a lie. But it's a lie that allows you to function in normal social situations without making everyone uncomfortable. You're learning to pass as someone who hasn't been broken and rebuilt from the ground up, but passing isn't the same as healing. And you're beginning to realize that healing, if it's even possible, is going to take a lot longer than you thought. Months pass. You settle into a routine that looks, from the outside, like a normal life. You work at the docks during the day. You come home to your small room in the evening. You eat simple meals and go to bed early. You save a little money each week, thinking vaguely about maybe finding a better place to live or better work. It's not happiness, but it's stability. And after years of chaos, stability feels like a luxury. But late at night, when the noise from the street dies down and you're lying in the dark, your mind wanders back to questions you've been avoiding. What was the point of surviving if you're not really living? What kind of person have you become? And is that person someone you want to be? How do you build a life when you don't know what kind of life you want to build? These are the questions that will define the next phase of your story. Because surviving the labor camp was just the first challenge. Learning to live after surviving, that might be even harder. Spring 1946. You've been back in Shanghai for 6 months now, and you're beginning to understand that there are different kinds of prisons. The labor camp was one kind, concrete and immediate with barbed wire and guards. But there's another kind of prison that's harder to see and impossible to escape, the prison of your own mind. You're sitting in a noodle shop on a Tuesday afternoon, your day's work at the docks finished, when a man at the next table strikes a match to light his cigarette. The sound, that tiny pop of sulfur igniting, sends you immediately back to Burma. You can smell the jungle, hear the guards shouting, feel the weight of timber beams on your shoulders. Your hands start shaking so badly you have to put down your chopsticks. Sweat breaks out on your forehead despite the cool spring air. Your heart pounds like you've been running for miles. The man with the cigarette glances over at you with mild concern. You all right, friend? You want to explain that the sound of a match lighting reminds you of the dynamite fuses they used to blast through rock formations, and that the smell of sulfur takes you back to a place where that sound often meant someone was about to die. You want to tell him that your brain has been rewired by trauma to treat harmless everyday occurrences as potential threats. Instead, you nod and say, "Just tired. Long day at work." He shrugs and goes back to his noodles, and you sit there waiting for your nervous system to remember that you're in a restaurant in Shanghai, not a slave labor camp in Burma. This is your life now. Not constantly, but regularly. Unexpected moments when the past crashes into the present with the force of a physical blow, a sound, a smell, a particular quality of light, and suddenly you're not here anymore. You're there, reliving experiences you'd prefer to forget. The medical term for this is shell shock, though it won't be properly understood or treated for decades. Right now in 1946, the conventional wisdom is that strong men don't let bad experiences affect them. You're supposed to put the past behind you and move forward. Or you're supposed to be grateful you survived and get on with your life. The problem is, nobody explains how you're supposed to do that when your brain won't cooperate. But you're learning things about yourself that might surprise you. You're learning that trauma doesn't just damage, it also reveals. When everything familiar is stripped away, when you're reduced to your most basic elements, you discover what's actually at your core. And what you've discovered is that you're tougher than you thought, but in ways you never wanted to be. You can work a 14-hour day loading cargo ships without complaining, because 14 hours of voluntary labor feels like luxury compared to 14 hours of forced labor under threat of death. You can sleep on a narrow bed in a noisy rooming house without difficulty, because privacy and quiet are luxuries you've learned to live without. You can eat the same simple meal every day without boredom, because having regular meals at all still feels like a miracle. But you also can't handle crowds, because crowds remind you of being herded like cattle. You can't deal with authority figures, because your brain has learned to associate authority with arbitrary cruelty. You can't form close relationships, because 3 years of watching people die has taught you that emotional attachments are just opportunities for pain. You're functional, but you're not normal. And you're beginning to suspect that normal is something you're never going to be again. This realization comes gradually, but there's a specific moment when it becomes undeniable. You're walking home from work on a summer evening when you hear shouting from an alley. Not playful shouting, angry shouting with an undertone of violence that makes your skin crawl. Without thinking, you move toward the sound. In the alley, you find 3 men beating a 4th. The victim is on the ground, curled into a ball, while his attackers kick him and go through his pockets. It's a simple robbery, the kind of thing that happens in post-war cities where people are desperate and the police are overwhelmed. A normal person might call for help, or look for a police officer, or at least hesitate before getting involved in someone else's fight. You don't hesitate, you don't think, you don't consider the consequences. You pick up a piece of broken brick from the ground and attack. What happens next is a blur of violence that's over in less than a minute. When it's finished, 2 of the attackers are unconscious on the ground, the 3rd has fled with what appears to be a broken arm, and you're standing over them with bloody knuckles and no memory of exactly how you got there. The robbery victim, a middle-aged merchant who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time, looks at you with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Thank you," he says, but he's backing away as he says it. "Thank you, but who are you?" That's when you realize what just happened. You didn't save someone from a robbery through heroic intervention. You experienced a moment of dissociation where 3 years of suppressed rage erupted in an explosion of violence that was completely out of proportion to the situation. You weren't being a good Samaritan. You were being a weapon that someone else pointed at a target. This is what trauma does. It doesn't just damage your ability to feel safe, it damages your ability to control your responses to perceived threats. Your nervous system has been rewired for survival in an environment where violence was constant and mercy was fatal weakness. Now you're back in a world where violence is not constant and mercy is not weakness, but your brain hasn't gotten the memo. You help the merchant to his feet and walk away without giving your name. You don't want gratitude for what you did, because what you did wasn't heroic. It was the reflexive response of someone whose humanity has been temporarily short-circuited by trauma. That night, you lie awake, thinking about what kind of person you've become. 3 years ago, you were a drug addict, weak, dependent, focused only on your next fix. That was pathetic, but it was also essentially harmless. You hurt yourself, but you didn't hurt other people. Now you're clean, sober, and self-sufficient. But you're also someone who can beat 3 men unconscious without conscious thought. someone who responds to conflict with immediate violence, someone who's been shaped by experiences that most people can't even imagine. You're not better than you were before the war. You're just different, harder, more dangerous, less human in some ways, though perhaps more resilient in others. The question is, what do you do with this knowledge? You could try to become more like the person you were before, gentle, passive, conflict avoidant. But that person was weak in ways that made him vulnerable to exploitation. The drug addiction was just one symptom of a deeper inability to handle life's challenges without artificial assistance. Or you could accept that trauma has fundamentally changed you and try to channel those changes in positive directions. Use your newfound toughness to help people instead of hurt them. Use your understanding of suffering to identify others who are suffering and maybe help them bear it. This is the choice that will define the rest of your life. Do you let trauma destroy you? Or do you let it transform you into someone who can help prevent others from experiencing what you've experienced? It's not an easy choice, because both paths involve accepting that the person you were before the war is gone forever. There's no going back to innocence once you've seen what human beings are capable of doing to each other. But maybe innocence is overrated anyway. Maybe what the world needs isn't more innocent people, but more people who understand evil and choose to fight it. You start volunteering at a clinic that serves refugees and other displaced people. Not because you have medical training, you don't, but because you can recognize the signs of trauma in others. And sometimes just having someone acknowledge your pain can be the first step toward healing. You meet a young woman who spent 2 years hiding in caves while Japanese forces occupied her village. She hasn't spoken to anyone since she arrived in Shanghai 3 months ago. You don't try to get her to talk about her experiences. Instead, you just sit with her while she receives medical treatment, your presence a silent acknowledgement that she's been through hell and survived. After several visits, she finally speaks. Not about her trauma, but about practical things. Where to find work, how to get identity documents, which neighborhoods are safe for women living alone. It's not therapy in any clinical sense, but it's something valuable. One survivor helping another survivor navigate the complexities of rebuilding a life after everything familiar has been destroyed. You meet a man who spent 4 years as a prisoner of war and can't sleep because he's afraid that if he closes his eyes, he'll wake up back in captivity. You don't offer him advice or try to convince him that his fears are irrational. Instead, you tell him about your own experiences with insomnia, about the techniques you've developed for managing anxiety, about the small daily routines that help create a sense of safety and control. You meet children who've been orphaned by the war and don't understand why the adults around them seem so sad all the time. You can't explain the complexities of grief and trauma to a 6-year-old, but you can teach them simple games that help them feel like children again, even for a few minutes. This work doesn't pay anything, and it's emotionally exhausting, but it gives you something you've been missing: purpose. For years, your purpose was survival. Then it was getting your next fix. Then it was just survival again. But now, for the first time, since before your addiction began, you have a purpose that extends beyond your own immediate needs. You're not healing other people. That's beyond your capabilities. But you're helping them understand that healing is possible, that survival isn't the end of the story, that it's possible to build something meaningful from the wreckage of trauma. And in helping them, you're beginning to heal yourself. It's not dramatic healing, like in the movies where someone has a breakthrough moment and suddenly everything is better. It's slow, incremental healing that comes from discovering that your suffering has given you something valuable to offer others who are suffering. Your trauma doesn't disappear. The flashbacks don't stop. You still can't handle crowds or authority figures or sudden loud noises. You still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking you're back in the labor camp. But gradually, very gradually, these symptoms become manageable rather than overwhelming. Not because you've overcome them, but because you've found ways to live with them that don't prevent you from living. This is what recovery looks like for someone with severe trauma in the 1940s. Not a return to who you were before, but a slow, painful process of building a new identity from the pieces of the old one. By the end of 1946, you've been back in Shanghai for over a year. You still work at the docks during the day, but several evenings a week you volunteer at the refugee clinic. You've moved to a slightly better room in a slightly better neighborhood. You've even started saving money, though you're not sure what you're saving for. You're not happy exactly, but you're not miserable either. You're something in between. A person who's learned to find meaning in a world that often seems meaningless. Someone who's discovered that survival can be its own form of victory. And late at night, when you're lying in the dark and your mind starts to wander back to Burma, you have something new to think about. The people you've helped, the small differences you've made, the proof that your suffering wasn't entirely meaningless. It's not much, but it's enough. And after everything you've been through, enough is a kind of miracle. 1950. 4 years have passed since you returned from Burma, and you're beginning to understand something that nobody tells you about recovery. It's not a destination, it's a daily practice. You wake up each morning in a small apartment that you can finally call your own. 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a window that faces east, so you get morning sunlight. It's not much by most standards, but it's the first space you've controlled completely since before the war. No guards, no bunkmates, no one telling you when to sleep or wake or eat. The ritual of making morning tea has become almost sacred to you, not because you're particularly spiritual, but because it's a routine that belongs entirely to you. Water in the kettle, leaves in the pot, waiting for the whistle that means another day is beginning on your terms. This small freedom still feels remarkable after all these years. Your work has evolved too. You still spend part of your time at the docks. The physical labor helps keep your mind occupied and your body strong, but you've also become something like an unofficial counselor for other survivors who drift through Shanghai's refugee services. Word gets around in communities like this. People whisper about the quiet man who understands things that can't be explained, who doesn't ask questions but somehow knows the right things to say, or more often, knows when not to say anything at all. Today, you're meeting with Chen Wei, a former nationalist soldier who spent 3 years in a Japanese prison camp before escaping during the chaos of the surrender. He's been back for 2 years, but he can't hold a job because he can't handle being inside buildings for more than an hour at a time. Walls, he explains, sitting on a bench in the small park where you meet people who can't tolerate enclosed spaces. Can't deal with walls? Even thinking about them makes me sweat. You nod, understanding immediately. How long can you manage indoors? Depends. Office buildings, maybe 20 minutes. Factories, even less. Stores are okay if they're not crowded, and I can see the exits. This is classic prisoner psychology. After years of being locked in cells, any enclosed space triggers panic responses. Chen Wei's nervous system has learned to associate walls with captivity, and no amount of rational thinking can override that association. What about outdoor work, you ask? Better, but he shrugs. Most outdoor work requires you to go inside eventually, for meetings, for supplies, for breaks when the weather's bad. And employers don't understand why someone would rather stand in the rain than sit in a comfortable office. You've had this conversation dozens of times with different people. The practical challenges of trauma aren't just psychological, they're economic. How do you build a stable life when your brain won't let you function in normal work environments? I might know someone, you tell him. A man named Liu, who runs a small shipping operation. Mostly outdoor work, loading and unloading boats at the smaller docks. He's understanding about people who have difficulties with conventional employment. Liu is a survivor himself, lost his entire family during the rape of Nanking and spent the war years moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He understands that some people need work arrangements that accommodate their particular damages. Chen Wei's face brightens slightly. You think he might have something? Maybe. I'll talk to him tomorrow, see what he says. This is how your unofficial network operates. Survivors helping other survivors find ways to live with their wounds. It's not therapy, exactly, and it's not charity. It's more like a mutual aid society for people who've been broken in similar ways. After Chen Wei leaves, you walk to the clinic where you volunteer 3 evenings a week. The clinic has expanded since you started working there. What began as a single room treating refugees has grown into a small organization that provides medical care, job placement assistance, and basic counseling services. You're not a trained counselor, but you've learned to listen in ways that help people feel less alone with their suffering. Sometimes that's enough. Tonight you're working with Li Mei, a woman in her 30s, who survived the siege of Changchun by eating bark and grass for 8 months. She's been back in Shanghai for 6 months, but she hoards food compulsively and can't eat regular meals. I know it's irrational, she says, sitting in the small room where you meet with people who need to talk. I know there's enough food now. I know I don't need to save every scrap, but I can't stop myself. She opens her handbag to show you. Packages of crackers, dried fruit, nuts, small tins of meat. Enough food for several days, carefully wrapped and organized. I carry this everywhere, she says, even to the market when I'm going to buy more food. I know how crazy it sounds, but the thought of being without food, I start to panic. This isn't crazy. This is a rational response to an irrational situation. Her brain learned through bitter experience that food security is never guaranteed, that survival depends on constantly preparing for the next famine. How much sleep are you getting, you ask? Not much. I wake up several times a night to check that my food stores are still there. Sometimes I count the packages to make sure nothing's missing. You've seen this pattern before. Trauma doesn't just affect how people respond to threats. It affects how they define threats. Li Mei's nervous system has been rewired to treat hunger as an existential emergency, and no amount of current abundance can override that programming. Have you tried eating smaller meals more frequently, you suggest? Instead of 3 large meals a day, maybe 6 small ones? It might help your brain understand that food is consistently available. It's not a cure, but it's a practical strategy that sometimes helps. Small, frequent meals can gradually retrain the nervous system to expect regular nourishment instead of cycling between feast and famine. I could try that, she says. But what about the hoarding? I know it's not normal, but I can't seem to stop. Maybe don't try to stop, you suggest. Maybe just set some boundaries around it. Carry 1 day's worth of emergency food instead of 3 days' worth. or designate one drawer in your apartment for food storage, but don't let it overflow into other areas. This is harm reduction rather than elimination, acknowledging that some behaviors serve important psychological functions, even when they seem irrational from the outside. Lime nods thoughtfully. Make it smaller and more controlled instead of trying to eliminate it completely. Exactly. Work with your brain instead of against it. These conversations are never dramatic. No breakthrough moments, no sudden revelations, no tearful catharsis, just practical discussions about how to manage the aftermath of extreme experiences. But they matter. You can see it in people's faces when they realize they're not alone with their strange compulsions and inexplicable fears. There's relief in discovering that other people have similar struggles, that trauma produces predictable patterns of behavior, that there are strategies for living with psychological wounds that may never fully heal. After the clinic closes, you walk home through streets that have become familiar again. Shanghai is rebuilding itself slowly and unevenly. Some neighborhoods have been restored to something approaching their pre-war condition. Others remain scarred by bombing and battle, their broken buildings serving as monuments to destruction. You've learned to read the city's wounds the way you read people's wounds, recognizing which damages are healing and which ones have become permanent features of the landscape. Your own healing follows a similar pattern. Some aspects of your trauma have faded with time and treatment. The constant hypervigilance has diminished to manageable levels. The startle responses are less frequent and less severe. You can sleep through the night most of the time, but other aspects seem to be permanent fixtures of your personality. You still can't handle crowds or enclosed spaces very well. You still respond to authority figures with suspicion and anxiety. You still have trouble forming close relationships because emotional intimacy feels dangerous. You've learned to think of these not as defects to be cured, but as scars to be managed. Like a broken bone that heals crooked but still functions, your psyche has healed around the damage in ways that leave you different but not necessarily disabled. The opium addiction feels like something that happened to a different person in a different lifetime. Not because you've forgotten it, but because the neural pathways that created and sustained that addiction have been overwritten by more pressing survival programs. It's like learning that you used to enjoy a particular song, but now when you hear it, it doesn't move you at all. The song hasn't changed, but your ears have been tuned to different frequencies. Sometimes you wonder what would have happened if the war hadn't intervened in your addiction. Would you have eventually hit bottom and sought recovery on your own? Would you have died in an opium den, just another casualty of chemical dependence? Or would you have continued that slow decline indefinitely, functional enough to maintain your habit, but too compromised to build any kind of meaningful life? There's no way to know, of course. History doesn't offer alternate timelines for comparison. But you suspect that without the brutal intervention of forced withdrawal in the labor camp, you might never have discovered your capacity for endurance. The war didn't cure your addiction. It simply made the addiction irrelevant compared to more immediate threats. What cured your addiction was learning that you could survive unimaginable hardship without chemical assistance. Once you knew that about yourself, the appeal of artificial escape diminished considerably. This doesn't mean you're grateful for the war or the labor camp. That would be absurd. But it does mean you've learned to extract some value from terrible experiences, not by romanticizing them, but by understanding how they've shaped your capacity to help others. By 1951, your informal counseling work has become semi-formal. The clinic asks you to run a weekly support group for trauma survivors. Nothing fancy, just 8 or 10 people sitting in a circle talking about practical strategies for managing the aftermath of extreme experiences. The group includes former prisoners of war, rape survivors, people who witnessed massacres, families who lost children to starvation, soldiers who can't forget what they did or saw during combat. Each person's trauma is different, but the patterns of recovery are surprisingly similar. The hypervigilance, the sleep disruption, the difficulty trusting other people, the way normal stresses feel overwhelming because your nervous system is still calibrated for life or death situations. The thing that bothers me most, says Wang Ling, a woman whose village was burned by retreating Japanese soldiers, is that I used to be brave. I used to stand up for myself, speak my mind, take risks. Now I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid of loud noises, afraid of strangers, afraid of being alone, afraid of being in groups. I feel like I've become a completely different person. This is a common theme. People don't just mourn the specific losses caused by trauma, they mourn the loss of who they used to be. Maybe you haven't become a different person, you suggest. Maybe you've learned different survival skills. In your village before the war, being brave and outspoken were probably good strategies, but during the war, being quiet and careful were better strategies. Your brain learned to prioritize survival over self-expression. But the war's over now, she says. I should be able to go back to being who I was before. Maybe, you say. Or maybe you're someone new now, someone who understands both courage and caution, both strength and vulnerability. Maybe the goal isn't to go back to who you were, but to integrate who you were with who you've become. This is the central challenge of trauma recovery. How do you honor both your pre-trauma self and your post-trauma self? How do you acknowledge that terrible experiences have changed you without allowing them to define you entirely? It's a question you're still working on yourself, but you've learned that the answer isn't the same for everyone. Some people find healing by reclaiming aspects of their pre-trauma personality. Others find it by embracing their post-trauma changes and learning to see them as adaptations rather than damages. Most people, you suspect, find some combination of both. As 1951 turns into 1952, you realize that you've built something you never expected to have. A life that has meaning beyond survival. Not a perfect life, not an easy life, but a life that serves a purpose larger than just getting through each day. You work at the docks to pay your bills. You volunteer at the clinic to help other survivors. You run the support group to create community among people who understand each other's struggles. You maintain your small apartment as a space of safety and autonomy. It's not the life you planned when you were young, before addiction and war and trauma reshaped your possibilities. But it's a good life nonetheless, a life built from the wreckage of terrible experiences, and shaped by the understanding that survival is only the beginning of recovery. And late at night, when you're lying in your own bed in your own apartment, listening to the sounds of a city that's learning to live in peace again, you sometimes feel something that might be contentment. Not happiness, exactly. Happiness feels too simple for someone who's seen what you've seen. But contentment, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that you've endured the worst life could throw at you and found ways to help others endure their own worst experiences, it's enough. After everything you've been through, enough is a kind of victory. 1955. 10 years since the end of the war, 6 years since you returned to Shanghai, and you're sitting in a tea house with a young man named David Chen, who's just returned from fighting in Korea. He's 23 years old, which means he was 13 when the Second World War ended. And he's looking at you like you might have answers to questions he doesn't know how to ask. My father says you understand things, he says, nervously turning his teacup in its saucer. About what happens after. You study his face, the hollow eyes, the way he startles slightly when the server drops a spoon in the kitchen, the careful way he sits with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. These are patterns you recognize. What do you want to understand, you ask? How to... He stops, starts again. How to be normal again. How to care about normal things. How to make people understand without having to explain everything. This is the eternal question of the combat survivor. How do you return to a world that continued functioning while you were learning that human beings are capable of extraordinary cruelty? What feels different, you ask? Everything. Food tastes like cardboard. Movies seem stupid. People complain about things that don't matter. My girlfriend wants to know why I'm different, but how do I explain watching my best friend step on a mine? How do I tell her that I killed people and that sometimes I dream about their faces? You remember asking similar questions, though your trauma came from being a victim rather than a perpetrator. But trauma is trauma. It rewires the nervous system and reshapes priorities in ways that make peacetime life feel simultaneously trivial and overwhelming. Do you want to be normal again, you ask? He looks surprised by the question. Of course I do, don't I? I don't know. Do you? He's quiet for a long time, thinking. I miss being able to enjoy simple things, he finally says. I miss feeling like the future mattered. I miss not knowing what I'm capable of when I'm afraid. Those are things you miss about innocence, you say. But innocence and normalcy aren't the same thing. You order more tea while you consider how to explain something that took you years to understand. Before the war, you continue, I was addicted to opium. I thought my biggest problem was where to get my next fix. I thought normal life was unbearable without chemical assistance. I thought I was weak and pathetic and couldn't handle reality. David nods, recognizing the tone of someone describing their former self. Then, I spent 3 years in a Japanese labor camp. I learned what real suffering looks like. I learned what real strength is. I learned that I could endure things I never imagined surviving. When I came back, I wasn't the same person. Did you want to be? For a while, yes. I wanted to go back to worrying about small things, to finding joy in simple pleasures, to believing that the world was basically good and that bad things happened to other people. But you couldn't. I couldn't. But eventually I realized I didn't want to. Because the person I was before, that innocent, naive person, he was also the person who was vulnerable to exploitation. He was the person who couldn't handle life's challenges without drugging himself into oblivion. David is listening intently now, leaning forward slightly. The person I became after trauma, he's harder, more suspicious, less trusting. But he's also stronger, more resilient, better able to help other people who are suffering. I lost my innocence, but I gained something else. What? Wisdom. Compassion that comes from experience rather than sentiment. The knowledge that I can survive almost anything and the ability to help others survive almost anything. You pause to let this sink in, then continue. The question isn't whether you can go back to being normal. The question is whether you want to build a new kind of normal that incorporates what you've learned about yourself and the world. David sits back in his chair, processing this. But people expect you to just bounce back, to be grateful you survived and move on with your life. People who haven't been through trauma don't understand that survival is just the beginning. They think if you're physically intact and not actively dying, you should be fine. They don't understand that your brain has been rewired for survival in conditions that no longer exist. This is something you've learned from years of working with trauma survivors. The general public has very little understanding of what extreme experiences do to human psychology. They expect linear recovery. You get hurt, you heal, you return to baseline. They don't understand that some experiences change you permanently, not necessarily for the worse, but certainly forever. So what do I do? David asks. How do I live in a world where people think my problems should be solved by now? You learn to translate between two languages, you tell him. The language of trauma, which you speak fluently now, and the language of normalcy, which most people speak. You learn to give people the version of your story they can handle, while finding other survivors who can handle the full version. Like this conversation. Exactly like this conversation. You've had some version of this conversation hundreds of times over the past few years. Young men returning from Korea, older men still struggling with memories of the Second World War, women who survived sexual violence, children who witnessed atrocities, all of them asking variations of the same question. How do you build a life worth living after experiences that shatter your basic assumptions about the world? The answer is different for everyone, but there are common themes. First, you have to grieve for the person you were before. That person is gone, and pretending otherwise just delays the necessary work of figuring out who you are now. Second, you have to find meaning in your suffering, not by romanticizing it or being grateful for it, but by using what you've learned to help prevent others from experiencing similar pain. Third, you have to build community with other survivors. People who haven't experienced trauma can be sympathetic, but they can't be truly understanding. You need relationships with people who speak your language. Fourth, you have to develop practical strategies for managing the ongoing effects of trauma. Sleep hygiene, stress management, recognizing triggers, avoiding situations that overwhelm your nervous system. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, you have to accept that recovery is not a destination but a daily practice. Some days will be better than others. Some symptoms will improve while others remain constant. Healing is not about returning to who you were before, but about learning to live fully with who you are now. David and you talk for another hour, covering practical topics. How to explain sudden mood changes to people who care about you, how to find work that accommodates trauma-related limitations, how to build intimate relationships when emotional vulnerability feels dangerous. When he leaves, he shakes your hand with the firm grip of someone who's been reminded that he's not alone with his struggles. This is what your life has become. A bridge between the world of trauma and the world of normalcy, helping people cross from one to the other without falling into the gap between them. It's not dramatic work. No one writes newspaper articles about informal trauma counseling or gives awards for helping veterans adjust to civilian life, but it's necessary work, and it's work that can only be done by people who've been where these survivors have been. As you walk home from the tea house, you reflect on how much has changed since that first desperate morning when you woke up needing opium and ended up conscripted into a slave labor gang. That man, the addict who couldn't function without chemical assistance, seems like a character from someone else's story. Not because you've forgotten him, but because the experiences that followed transformed you so completely that it's hard to believe you were ever that person. The transformation wasn't voluntary, and it wasn't pleasant. You didn't choose to be beaten, starved, worked to exhaustion, and forced to watch other human beings die from preventable causes. You didn't choose to have your brain rewired for survival under extreme conditions. But once those changes happened, you did choose what to do with them. You could have used your trauma as an excuse for bitterness, isolation, or continued self-destruction. Many people do, and you don't judge them for it. Trauma affects everyone differently, and not everyone finds positive ways to channel their suffering. Instead, you chose to use your understanding of survival to help others survive. You chose to transform your pain into purpose, your wounds into wisdom, your suffering into service. This doesn't make you special or heroic. It just makes you someone who found a way to extract meaning from meaningless experiences. By 1956, your informal counseling work has become more formal. The clinic where you volunteer has received government funding to expand their trauma services, and they've offered you a paid position as a peer counselor. It's not much money, barely enough to cover your basic expenses, but it's enough to let you quit the doc work and focus full-time on helping other survivors. Your first official client is a woman named Mary Wong, who spent 2 years in a Japanese comfort station during the war. She's one of the few women willing to talk about these experiences, and her courage in seeking help, despite the social stigma, makes you deeply respect her. I don't know if I can be fixed, she tells you during your first session. Some things break you in ways that can't be repaired. You understand what she means. Sexual trauma, particularly sustained sexual trauma, damages people in ways that are difficult to address through conventional therapy approaches. Maybe the goal isn't to be fixed, you suggest. Maybe the goal is to find ways to live well despite being broken in certain places. Is that possible? I think so. I think most of us are broken in various places. The people who seem undamaged have just been lucky enough to avoid experiences that reveal how fragile we all are. This becomes your therapeutic philosophy. Not that people can be returned to some imaginary state of wholeness, but that they can learn to live meaningfully with their particular damages. Mary's healing process takes years, not months. She learns to manage flashbacks, to set boundaries in relationships, to recognize when she's being triggered and needs to remove herself from situations. She never becomes the carefree person she might have been without trauma, but she becomes someone who can experience joy, form connections, and find purpose despite carrying terrible memories. Watching her progress reinforces something you've learned about trauma recovery. It's not about erasing the past, but about learning to carry it without being crushed by its weight. Your client list grows. Veterans from multiple wars, survivors of political persecution, women who've experienced sexual violence, children who witnessed atrocities, families who lost everything to conflict or natural disaster. Each person brings a unique constellation of symptoms and strengths, but the fundamental challenge is always the same. How do you rebuild a life when your basic assumptions about safety, trust, and meaning have been shattered? The work is emotionally demanding, but it's also deeply satisfying. Not because you can cure trauma, you can't, but because you can help people understand that survival is possible, that meaning can be found even in the aftermath of meaningless suffering. By 1958, you've been working as a trauma counselor for 3 years. The field is slowly developing more sophisticated approaches, new theories about how trauma affects the brain, new techniques for helping people process difficult memories, new understanding of the long-term effects of extreme stress. But you've learned that the most important element of trauma recovery isn't technical knowledge or therapeutic techniques. It's the simple recognition that the person seeking help is not broken or defective, but injured. And injuries, even severe ones, can heal given proper care and enough time. One evening, you're walking home from work when you encounter a scene that takes you immediately back to 1945. A man in tattered clothes, obviously malnourished, digging through garbage bins behind a restaurant. But this isn't 1945, and this man isn't a war refugee. He's one of Shanghai's growing population of opium addicts, people who found their way to the drug through various paths, and now spend their days in the same desperate cycle you once knew so well. You approach him carefully, the way you would approach any wounded animal. "When did you eat last?" you ask. He looks up at you with the suspicious eyes of someone who's learned that kindness often comes with conditions he can't afford to meet. "Yesterday," he says. "Maybe the day before. Hard to keep track." You recognize the voice of active addiction, the way time becomes fluid when your entire existence revolves around obtaining and using drugs. "There's a noodle shop around the corner," you say. "Let me buy you a meal." He stares at you for a long moment, trying to calculate whether this is some kind of trap. "What do you want?" he asks. "Nothing. I've been where you are. I know what it's like to be hungry." This is true, though your hunger came from a labor camp rather than addiction. But hunger is hunger. In desperation, over a bowl of noodles and vegetables, he tells you his story. It's depressingly familiar. Chronic pain from a work injury, introduction to opium for pain relief, gradual escalation from medicinal use to addiction, loss of job and family, descent into the underground economy of drug dependency. His name is Chen Jiming, and he's 34 years old, though he looks 50. Addiction has aged him the way trauma aged you. Prematurely, visibly, in ways that can't be undone. "I know I need to stop," he says. "I know it's killing me. But every time I try to quit, the sickness is so bad I can't think straight. And there's no place to go, no one to help. The police just arrest addicts, they don't treat them." All this is 1958, and addiction treatment consists primarily of imprisonment or moral condemnation. The medical understanding of dependency is rudimentary, and the social support systems are non-existent. What if there was a place, you ask? A place where you could detox safely with medical supervision and people who understand what you're going through? There's no such place. Not yet. But what if there could be? This conversation plants a seed that will grow into your next major project, advocating for the establishment of Shanghai's first addiction treatment facility. It takes 3 years of meetings with government officials, medical professionals, and social service organizations. 3 years of writing proposals, presenting research, and slowly building support for the radical idea that addiction should be treated as a medical condition rather than a moral failing. The resistance is enormous. Addiction is seen as a sign of weak character, and addicts are viewed as people who've chosen their condition and therefore deserve whatever suffering it brings them. But you have something most advocates don't: personal experience. You can speak about addiction from the inside, and you can speak about recovery as someone who's actually achieved it. Addiction isn't a choice, you tell a room full of government health officials. It's a medical condition that develops when people use substances to cope with physical or emotional pain they can't manage any other way. The choice is whether we treat it as a disease or continue to treat it as a crime. But these people chose to use drugs initially, objects one official. Yes, just like people choose to eat food that makes them sick, or work jobs that damage their health, or enter relationships that hurt them. People make choices based on their circumstances and their understanding of their options. When someone is in chronic pain and opium is the only available pain relief, using it isn't irrational. It's survival. This is a hard argument to make in a culture that values personal responsibility and views suffering as character building. But slowly, very slowly, you begin to change minds. The breakthrough comes when you partner with Dr. Lynn Waming, a physician who's been studying addiction from a medical perspective. Together, you develop a proposal for a pilot program, a small residential facility where addicts can detox under medical supervision and receive counseling about the underlying issues that led to their drug use. The program is approved on a trial basis in 1961, with funding for 20 beds and a staff of 6 people. It's not much, but it's a beginning. The Shanghai Addiction Recovery Center opens its doors on a gray morning in March 1962. You're there for the first admission, a young woman named Li Ping who's been using opium for 2 years and is pregnant with her first child. "Will my baby be okay?" she asks, her hands shaking as she signs the admission papers. "We don't know," Dr. Lin tells her honestly, "but we're going to do everything we can to help both of you." This becomes the center's philosophy. Honest acknowledgement of uncertainty combined with commitment to providing the best possible care. The facility is basic, converted dormitory buildings with medical equipment that's outdated but functional. The staff includes Dr. Lin, 2 nurses, a social worker, and you as the primary addiction counselor. Your role is to help clients understand the psychological aspects of their addiction and develop strategies for living without drugs. It's similar to your trauma counseling work, but with some key differences. Trauma survivors are dealing with experiences that happened to them. Addiction survivors are dealing with choices they made, even if those choices were made under circumstances that limited their options. This means addiction counseling involves more explicit discussion of personal responsibility, guilt, and shame. "I destroyed my family," says Wang Tao, a businessman who lost everything to opium addiction. "My wife left me, my children won't speak to me, my business partners won't work with me. How do I live with knowing that I caused all of this?" "You didn't cause your addiction," you tell him, "but you are responsible for what you do about it now." This distinction between responsibility for developing addiction and responsibility for addressing it becomes central to your counseling approach. People don't choose to become addicted, but they can choose to seek recovery. They can't undo the damage they've caused while using drugs, but they can choose to stop causing further damage. The center's early results are mixed. Some clients complete the detox process and maintain sobriety for months or years. Others relapse immediately after discharge. A few die from complications related to their drug use. This is the reality of addiction treatment. It doesn't work for everyone, and even when it does work, it requires ongoing effort and support. But for the people it does help, the transformation is remarkable. Li Ping gives birth to a healthy daughter and remains clean throughout her pregnancy and beyond. Wang Tao rebuilds his relationship with his children and starts a small business that employs other people in recovery. Chen Jiaming, the man you found digging through garbage bins, becomes a peer counselor at the center and helps dozens of other addicts through their own recovery processes. These success stories don't erase the failures, but they prove that recovery is possible even for people who seem completely hopeless. By 1965, the center has expanded to 50 beds and has treated over 300 people. The success rate is about 30%, meaning about 1 in 3 people who enter the program achieve long-term sobriety. It's not a cure, but it's hope. And for people who've been living without hope, that's revolutionary. Your work at the center brings you full circle in an unexpected way. You're helping people overcome the same addiction that once defined your life, but you're doing it from a position of strength rather than weakness. The irony isn't lost on you. Your addiction, which seemed like the worst thing that could happen to you, led to experiences that gave you the tools to help others overcome their addictions. This doesn't mean you're grateful for your addiction. That would be absurd. But it does mean you found a way to transform your worst experiences into something valuable for other people. As the 1960s progress, addiction treatment becomes more sophisticated. New medications are developed to ease withdrawal symptoms. Psychological theories about dependency become more nuanced. Social support systems expand to include halfway houses, job training programs, and family counseling services. You're part of this evolution, contributing your experiential knowledge to the growing body of research about addiction and recovery. But the core insight remains the same. Addiction is a medical condition that responds to treatment, and recovery is possible for people who receive appropriate care and support. Your own recovery continues to evolve as well. It's been over 20 years since you used opium, but you still consider yourself in recovery rather than recovered. Not because you're at risk of relapse, that urge disappeared long ago, but because recovery is an ongoing process of growth and self-understanding. You've learned to see your addiction, your wartime experiences, and your work helping others as parts of a single story. The story of someone who survived extraordinary challenges and used those experiences to help others survive their own challenges. It's not the story you would have chosen when you were young. You would have preferred a simpler path, steady work, a family, a quiet life without drama or trauma. But it's a meaningful story nonetheless, and meaning you've learned is more important than comfort. In 1968, you're invited to speak at an international conference on addiction treatment. It's the first time you've told your complete story to an audience of medical professionals from around the world. You talk about your early addiction, your forced withdrawal in the labor camp, your struggles with trauma, and your eventual work helping others overcome similar challenges. When you finish, the audience is silent for a long moment. Then they begin to applaud. Not the polite applause of academic conferences, but the sustained applause of people who've been moved by something they weren't expecting to hear. Later, during the reception, a young doctor from America approaches you. "That was extraordinary," she says. "I've never heard anyone describe the connection between trauma and addiction so clearly. Have you considered writing about your experiences?" You haven't, actually. Your focus has been on practical work rather than reflection or documentation. But her suggestion plants another seed. Over the next few years, you begin writing about your experiences, not for publication initially, but as a way of organizing your thoughts about trauma, addiction, and recovery. The writing process is difficult. Revisiting painful memories is never pleasant, even when you're doing it for constructive purposes. But it's also illuminating. Putting your experiences into words helps you understand patterns and connections that weren't obvious while you were living through them. You begin to see how your addiction made you vulnerable to exploitation, how trauma forced you to develop resilience, how survival skills became the foundation for helping others survive. You see how each phase of your life prepared you for the next phase, even when the preparation was painful and unwanted. The book is published in 1972 under the title From Opium to Hope, A Journey Through Addiction, War, and Recovery. It's not a bestseller, but it finds its audience among addiction counselors, trauma therapists, and people struggling with their own recovery. More importantly, it becomes a testament to the possibility of transformation. Not the kind of dramatic transformation promised by self-help books, but the slow, difficult transformation that comes from facing reality without illusions and finding ways to serve others despite your own wounds. The final chapter of the book ends with these words: "I'm not grateful for my addiction, my wartime experiences, or my trauma. These were not gifts or blessings or necessary steps on a predetermined path. They were random catastrophes that could have destroyed me completely. But I am grateful for what I learned about resilience, about the possibility of survival under impossible circumstances, and about the capacity of human beings to help each other bear unbearable burdens. I learned that recovery is not about returning to who you were before, but about becoming someone who can live fully with who you are now. I learned that meaning is not something you find, but something you create through service to others. And I learned that hope is not a feeling, but a practice, the daily practice of believing that tomorrow can be better than today, even when today feels unbearable. These lessons came at a terrible price, but they have allowed me to help hundreds of other people find their own paths to recovery and meaning. If my suffering has served any purpose, it is this: to prove that survival is possible, that transformation is possible, and that even the worst experiences can be transformed into something valuable for others. This is what we owe each other: the willingness to transform our wounds into wisdom, our pain into purpose, our survival into service. It is not an easy debt to pay, but it is the only one that really matters. Hey guys, we've reached the end of our journey through one of the most harrowing survival stories of the 20th century. If you're still with me, if you've made it through all the darkness and brutality and gradual emergence into something like light, then you've witnessed something remarkable: the complete transformation of a human being under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Let me ask you something. When we started this story, did you think our protagonist would make it? Not just survive physically, though that was never guaranteed, but emerge as someone who could help others, someone who found meaning in suffering, someone who transformed trauma into purpose? I'm guessing not. And honestly, neither did I when I first encountered this story. Because addiction stories don't usually end with recovery. War stories don't usually end with wisdom. Trauma stories don't usually end with service to others. Most of the time, these stories end badly, with death or permanent disability or lives destroyed by experiences too overwhelming to process. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, they end differently. Sometimes people are broken in ways that paradoxically make them stronger. Sometimes the worst experiences become the foundation for the best contributions. Sometimes survival itself becomes a form of victory that creates ripple effects across generations. This is one of those stories. Now, I want to be crystal clear about something. I'm not romanticizing suffering. I'm not suggesting that trauma is good for people, or that addiction serves some higher purpose, or that war and brutality are necessary for human growth. That would be bullshit of the highest order. What I am suggesting is that human beings have a remarkable capacity to transform even the worst experiences into something meaningful. Not automatically, not easily, not without tremendous effort and often tremendous cost, but it's possible. And when it happens, it's one of the most inspiring demonstrations of human resilience you'll ever encounter. Think about what we've witnessed here. A man whose life was defined by chemical dependency, someone who couldn't function without artificial substances, whose entire existence revolved around obtaining and using drugs, was forced through circumstances beyond his control to discover reserves of strength he never knew he possessed. A person who thought he was weak learned that he could endure unimaginable hardship. Someone who thought he needed chemical assistance to cope with life learned that he could survive literal hell without any external support. A man who had been broken by addiction was rebuilt by trauma into someone capable of helping others overcome their own brokenness. Now, this isn't a fairy tale with a neat, happy ending. Our protagonist never fully recovered from his wartime experiences. He carried psychological scars for the rest of his life. He never became the person he might have been without addiction and trauma, but he became someone else, someone who understood suffering intimately and could therefore help others bear their own suffering. Someone who knew what real strength looked like because he'd been forced to develop it. Someone who could speak to people in their darkest moments because he'd been in similar darkness himself. That's the real lesson here. Not that suffering is good, but that it's possible to extract something good from even the worst suffering. And here's what's particularly relevant for us today. We're living in a time when a lot of people are struggling with various forms of addiction, trauma, and despair. Mental health crises, substance abuse epidemics, social isolation, economic anxiety, political polarization. We've got our own versions of the challenges our protagonist faced. Maybe not as extreme. Most of us aren't going to be enslaved in labor camps or forced to build railways at gunpoint, but the underlying psychological dynamics are similar. How do you find meaning when life feels meaningless? How do you develop resilience when everything seems to be falling apart? How do you help others when you're struggling to help yourself? The answer, if there is one, seems to be this. You start where you are, with what you have, and you focus on service to others. You don't wait until you're fully healed to help other people heal. You don't wait until you've solved all your problems to help others solve their problems. You don't wait until you've achieved perfect mental health to support others who are struggling with their mental health. You use whatever wisdom you've gained from your own struggles, however limited that wisdom might be, to help others who are facing similar struggles. This isn't about being a savior or having all the answers. It's about recognizing that your experiences, even your worst experiences, have given you insights that might be valuable to others. The man in our story didn't become a professional counselor because he was free from trauma. He became a counselor because his trauma had taught him things about survival and resilience that could help other traumatized people. His addiction didn't disqualify him from helping other addicts. It qualified him. His experience with forced labor didn't make him too damaged to help others. It made him uniquely suited to understand what extreme hardship does to the human psyche. This is what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. The idea that sometimes people don't just recover from trauma, they actually develop new strengths and perspectives that they wouldn't have had without the traumatic experience. It doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen to everyone. But when it does happen, it can transform not just the person who experienced the trauma, but everyone they subsequently help. So here's my challenge to you. What have your struggles taught you that might be valuable to others? What has your pain shown you about the human condition that could help someone else navigate their own pain? Maybe you've dealt with addiction or mental health issues or family dysfunction or financial hardship or social isolation or any of the 1,000 other challenges that modern life throws at us. These experiences suck. I'm not suggesting you should be grateful for them or that they were somehow necessary for your development. But they have taught you things about resilience, about the complexity of human behavior, about what it's like to struggle, about what helps and what doesn't. And that knowledge, that hard-earned, painful knowledge, is valuable, not just to you, but to other people who are facing similar challenges. You don't need to start a treatment center or write a book or give speeches at conferences. You can start smaller. You can listen to a friend who's struggling. You can share your story with someone who needs to know they're not alone. You can volunteer at an organization that serves people dealing with challenges you understand. You can transform your wounds into wisdom, your pain into purpose, your survival into service. This isn't easy work. It requires you to revisit painful experiences, to be vulnerable about your struggles, to invest emotional energy in other people's problems when you might barely have enough energy for your own. But it's meaningful work. And meaning, as our protagonist discovered, is often more important than comfort. Plus, helping others often helps you process your own experiences. When you help someone else navigate a challenge you faced, you often gain new insights into your own journey. It's like the old saying, to teach is to learn twice. Now, before we wrap up, I want to acknowledge something. Not everyone who goes through terrible experiences emerges stronger or wiser or more capable of helping others. Sometimes trauma just breaks people, period. Sometimes addiction just destroys lives without any redemptive transformation. Sometimes survival is just survival, without any deeper meaning or purpose. That's the reality, and it's important to acknowledge it. The story we've explored tonight is remarkable precisely because it's unusual. Most people who experience what our protagonist experienced don't end up founding treatment centers or writing books or helping hundreds of other people. Most people just try to get by day to day, dealing with their wounds as best they can. And that's okay too. Survival itself is an achievement. Getting through each day without giving up is heroic, even if it doesn't look heroic from the outside. Not everyone needs to transform their trauma into a mission of service. Sometimes it's enough just to heal, or to learn to live with your wounds, or to find small moments of peace in a life that's been marked by suffering. But for those who do find ways to help others based on their own experiences, for those who manage to extract something valuable from their pain, the impact can be extraordinary. And one person's recovery can inspire dozens of other recoveries. One person's resilience can teach others how to be resilient. One person's transformation can prove to others that transformation is possible. This is what we've seen in our story tonight. How one man's journey from addiction through trauma to service created ripple effects that touched hundreds of lives and contributed to the development of more humane approaches to addiction treatment. His suffering wasn't meaningless because he found ways to prevent others from suffering in similar ways. His survival wasn't just personal victory because he used it to help others survive their own challenges. His transformation wasn't just individual growth because it became a model for what's possible when people refuse to let their worst experiences define their lives. So as we close out this long, difficult, but ultimately hopeful story, I want to leave you with this thought. Your experiences matter. Your struggles have taught you things. Your survival, if you're here listening to this, you are by definition a survivor, is proof that resilience is possible. You don't have to start a treatment center or write a book or become a professional counselor, but you can use what you've learned to help others learn similar lessons. You can transform your wounds into wisdom, your pain into purpose, your survival into service, and in doing so, you can prove that even the worst experiences can become the foundation for something meaningful. That's the lesson of survival. Not that suffering is good, but that it's possible to extract something good from even the worst suffering. Not that trauma is beneficial, but that it's possible to grow beyond trauma in ways that benefit others. Not that addiction serves a purpose, but that recovery from addiction can serve a purpose. This is what we owe each other. The willingness to transform our darkness into light for others who are still struggling in the dark. It's not an easy debt to pay, but it's the only one that really matters. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for sitting through the difficult parts and staying for the resolution. Thank you for caring about stories like this one. Stories that remind us what human beings are capable of enduring and what they're capable of becoming. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about your own experiences or your own capacity for resilience, let me know in the comments. Share your thoughts, your reactions, your own stories if you're comfortable doing so. And if you know someone who might benefit from hearing this story, someone who's struggling with addiction or trauma or just the general feeling that their life has been too damaged by past experiences to be meaningful, share it with them. Sometimes we all need reminders that transformation is possible, that survival can become service, that our worst experiences don't have to define our entire lives. Sometimes we all need proof that hope is not just a feeling, but a practice. The daily practice of believing that tomorrow can be better than today, even when today feels unbearable. This is that proof. Hit like if this story moved you, subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one's, and I'll see you next time when we dive into another corner of history that reveals something profound about the human capacity for endurance, transformation, and service to others. Until then, remember, your survival matters, your experiences have value, and your story, whatever it is, has the potential to help others write better endings to their own stories. Good night, and thank you for listening.